Okay, so it's Valentine's Day, but instead of, Cupid's arrows, let's talk about sharp elbows, the sharp elbows of power in the White House. We're diving deep into Project 2025, specifically a chapter about how a hypothetical conservative president could actually get stuff done, starting in, 2025.
It's fascinating how this chapter isn't focused on specific policies,
Yeah.
but the mechanics of power itself. It's almost like a playbook for navigating the complexities of government.
Right. It's less about what to do and more about how to do it. And there's some juicy stuff in here about the behind the scenes battles between appointed officials and those career government folks, and how even hiring rules can become a political weapon.
That's what makes this chapter so relevant to anyone who wants to understand how power really works. We often focus on the big picture, Congress, the president, but this deep dive is about the machinery underneath. That makes it all run.
And to appreciate how this hypothetical 2025 president could shake things up, maybe we need a little historical context first.
Good point. The role of the president and the White House has evolved dramatically since the Founding Fathers. They envisioned a much smaller federal government, with a president focused mainly on foreign policy and military matters.
So basically the opposite of what we have today.
Pretty much. Over time, events like the Great Depression and World War II drastically expanded the federal government's role, and as a result, the president's responsibilities. Now the president is expected to weigh in on virtually every issue, from healthcare and education to climate change and the economy.
Which is why this chapter's focus on staffing and structure is so important. It's not enough to have a vision. You need the right people and systems in place to execute it.
Absolutely. And the source is coming from a particularly interesting perspective. It argues that America is so divided that a conservative president can't just hope for the best. They need to be strategic, almost ruthless, in using the machinery of government to their advantage.
And they waste no time getting into the nitty-gritty details, starting with these kind of surprising roles that most people don't even think about.
Right. Take the staff secretary, for example.
Yeah.
It sounds pretty mundane. But this person controls all the information flowing to and from the president.
So they basically decide what the president sees and hears. That's a huge amount of power.
Exactly. And it's not just about managing information. This chapter argues that the staff secretary should be a true believer in the president's agenda, actively shaping the flow of information to support that agenda.
Wow. So it's not just a neutral gatekeeper role. It's much more strategic.
Precisely. And then there's the Office of White House Counsel, which traditionally provides legal advice. This chapter argues they should go further, becoming proactive advocates for the president's agenda, always within the bounds of law, of course.
So they're not just saying no, but finding ways to say yes, and here's how.
Exactly. It's a much more assertive role, focused on finding legal pathways to advance the president's goals.
And then there's the Office of Presidential Personnel, which doesn't exactly sound like a thriller.
But it's crucial. Remember, a new president needs to fill over 4,000 positions. Each appointment is a chance to either advance or obstruct their agenda. And the source is very clear. It's not just about qualifications.
You need people who are on board with your vision,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Personnel is policy, as they say. And this chapter stresses finding people who are not only competent, but also fiercely loyal to the president's agenda.
And this is where things start to get a little controversial, because the chapter claims that existing hiring rules actually make it harder to find the right people.
Yes. They point to these examples, like how an applicant's history of drug addiction or even obesity could move them to the front of the hiring line. It's meant to be inclusive. But the source argues it can lead to some absurd situations where less qualified individuals are favored.
It sounds like they're saying good intentions can sometimes backfire, especially when you're trying to build a team that can execute a specific vision.
Right. And it gets at a larger point this chapter makes, that a conservative president is going to face resistance from the entrenched bureaucracy, career government employees who may have different priorities or be resistant to change.
So how does a president overcome that? Do they just bring in a bunch of outsiders?
It's not that simple. You need people with government experience. But they also have to be loyal to the president's agenda. The chapter spends a lot of time on this balancing act, finding the right people for key positions to push things forward.
Okay, so let's talk about those key positions, because the chapter really emphasizes certain offices as being essential for success.
Yes. They highlight three in particular: the Office of Legislative Affairs, which handles working with Congress, sometimes battling Congress, to get the president's agenda passed. Then there's the Office of Communications, all about shaping the narrative, getting the president's message out. especially when the media might be hostile.
Which is a whole other beast these days with
Oh,
social media and the 24/7 news cycle, right?
absolutely. And finally, there's the Office of Public Liaison, which is all about building coalitions outside of government, connecting with interest groups, mobilizing support for the president's initiatives.
So basically, each of these offices plays a specific role in advancing the agenda, but they also need to work together, like a well-coordinated team.
Exactly. And the source stresses that each office needs clear goals, strong coordination, and a direct line to the chief of staff, who's like the conductor of this whole orchestra.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the actual policies themselves? This chapter seems focused on the mechanics, the HOW, but where do the ideas, the what come from?
That's where we get into the fascinating world of policy councils, those arenas where ideas are debated, refined, and ultimately brought to the president for a decision.
So like the National Security Council, the Economic Council, all those groups we hear about.
Exactly. The chapter focuses on three key councils: the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, and the Domestic Policy Council. And the source makes it very clear. These councils aren't about brainstorming new ideas. They're about coordinating existing ideas and getting things done across multiple government agencies.
So it's less about being creative and more about being effective.
Right. It's about taking the president's broad vision and turning it into concrete actions. And the chapter outlines a very specific process for how this happens. They describe a tiered system of committees, starting with lower-level groups, where staff hash out the details.
So like the nitty-gritty policy wonks digging into the weeds.
Exactly. Then it moves up to deputy-level committees, with higher-ranking officials trying to reach consensus.
And I'm guessing if they can't agree, it goes all the way up to the president for a final call.
Exactly. It's a fascinating glimpse into how decisions are made at the highest level and how that hypothetical 2025 president would wield their power.
But even with this structured process, the source hints at potential conflicts that can arise.
Yes, they specifically mention overlapping responsibilities between councils, which can lead to turf wars and power struggles. It requires strong leadership from the White House to resolve those conflicts and make sure everyone is pulling in the same direction.
It sounds like even with the best organizational chart, things can get messy. Human nature and all that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to a question that this chapter dances around, but doesn't fully address. They focus so much on the executive branch. But what about the other branches of government, specifically the judiciary?
That's a great point. How much can a president really achieve if the courts are opposed to their agenda?
That's a question worth pondering. Even with a well-staffed White House and a clear vision, a president's power isn't absolute. The courts can act as a powerful check, and their rulings can make or break a presidency.
So it's like another layer of complexity. On top of this already intricate system.
It is, and it's something we should keep in mind as we continue our deep dive. Because this chapter, while fascinating, is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding how power truly operates in American government.
Okay, so we've been talking about these policy councils and how they're supposed to be, these well-oiled machines churning out decisions. But something that struck me in the chapter is how much emphasis they put on the people involved.
Yes. They repeatedly stress that having the right people in the right positions is just as important as having a sound process.
It's like you can have the most brilliant strategy, but if you don't have a team that can execute it, it's all for nothing.
Precisely. And that's where the concept of political appointees versus career bureaucrats comes into play.
Right, because the chapter seems to be wary of relying too heavily on career government employees.
They argue that while career staff can provide valuable expertise and institutional knowledge, they might also have their own agendas or be resistant to the kind of sweeping changes this hypothetical president wants to make.
So it's like a potential clash of cultures almost.
Exactly. You have the political appointees who are brought in specifically to implement the president's vision. And then you have the career staff who've been working in the government for years, maybe even decades.
And who might be more invested in maintaining the status quo.
Right. So the chapter argues that a savvy president needs to find ways to manage this tension, to harness the expertise of career staff without letting them obstruct the broader agenda.
Which sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is. The source suggests several strategies. for achieving this balance, including clear communication, setting clear expectations, and empowering political appointees to exercise their authority.
So it's about setting a clear direction, making sure everyone understands the goals, and then giving those political appointees the tools they need to get the job done.
Exactly. And it also highlights the importance of having strong leaders in those key positions, people who can command respect, both from political appointees and career staff.
Because ultimately it's about creating a culture.
Of shared purpose.
Right.
Yes, a sense that everyone is working together towards a common goal, even if there are disagreements about the best way to get there.
And the source doesn't shy away from acknowledging that this can be a messy process.
They point to those seemingly irrational hiring rules we discussed earlier as an example of how well-intentioned policies that sometimes have unintended consequences.
Right. Because trying to be inclusive can sometimes lead to situations where less qualified individuals are favored over more qualified ones.
And that's just one small example of the kind of bureaucratic hurdles that a president might face when trying to implement their agenda.
So reforming the system itself becomes a crucial part of the equation.
Absolutely. The source argues that a conservative president needs to be willing to challenge the status quo, to identify areas where the bureaucracy is inefficient or counterproductive, and to push for meaningful reforms.
Which sounds easier said than done.
Oh, definitely. It requires not only political will, but also a deep understanding of how the system works and how to make changes without causing unintended consequences.
It's like trying to fix a car engine while it's still running.
Exactly. You need to be very careful not to break something else in the process.
So having a team of competent and loyal advisors is essential.
Absolutely. They need to be able to anticipate challenges, develop solutions, and guide the president through the complex process of reforming the government.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about staffing and bureaucracy, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about the actual policymaking process.
Yes, because while this chapter is focused on the hey-how-w of governing, it also touches on the where. Those key arenas where policy ideas are debated, refined, and ultimately brought to the president for a decision.
And those arenas are the policy councils, right?
Exactly. The source focuses on three main councils: the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, and the Domestic Policy Council, each with its own area of expertise, but often working together on issues that cross multiple domains.
Like immigration, for example, which has both domestic and national security implications.
Exactly. So these councils need to be well coordinated to avoid duplication of effort or conflicting policies.
And the chapter really emphasizes the importance of having a structured process within these councils.
Yes. It's not just a free-for-all of ideas, but a deliberate system designed to ensure that all viewpoints are heard, disagreements are resolved, and the president ultimately makes the final decision based on the best available information.
So what does that process look like?
The source describes a tiered system of committees, starting with lower-level working groups, where staff experts hash out the details.
So like the nitty-gritty policy wonks digging into the weeds.
Exactly. Then it moves up to deputy-level committees, where higher-ranking officials try to reach consensus. And finally, it culminates in the principals committees, which include cabinet secretaries and other top advisors.
And if they can't agree, I'm guessing it goes to the president for a final call.
Precisely. It's a fascinating glimpse into the hierarchy of decision-making and how power flows through the system.
But even with this structured process, the source acknowledges that things can get messy.
Yes. They specifically mention the potential for conflict between councils, especially when responsibilities overlap.
Like if the National Security Council and the Domestic Policy Council both have a stake in immigration policy, for example.
Exactly. That's where strong leadership from the White House is crucial, to resolve disputes and ensure that everyone is working towards the same goal.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act to keep all these different players aligned.
It is, and it highlights the importance of having a president who's not only a strong leader, but also a skilled manager, capable of navigating the complexities of the bureaucratic machine.
Okay, so we've got these policy councils churning out ideas, but then they need to be implemented, right?
Yes, that's where the rubber really meets the road. It's one thing to write a policy memo or issue an executive order. It's another thing entirely to make sure those directives are actually carried out by the vast and often unwieldy federal bureaucracy.
It's like the difference between designing a building and actually constructing it.
Exactly. You need skilled workers, the right materials, and a clear plan to turn the blueprint into reality.
And the source acknowledges that. This is where things can get really tricky.
They highlight several potential obstacles to effective implementation, including bureaucratic inertia, resistance from career staff, and even outright sabotage by those who oppose the president's agenda.
So it's not enough to have good ideas. You also need to have the ability to make them happen.
Precisely. And that's where the role of political appointees becomes even more important. They need to be the president's eyes and ears within the bureaucracy, making sure that policies are implemented faithfully and that any roadblocks are quickly removed.
So it's almost like a battle, right? You're trying to push through your agenda against a system that might be resistant to change.
In a way, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the source emphasizes the importance of empowering those political appointees, giving them clear authority, and holding them accountable for results.
But it's not just about top-down control, is it? It's also about building relationships, fostering communication, and creating a culture of shared purpose within the government.
Absolutely. Effective implementation requires more than just issuing orders. It requires leadership,
Yeah.
persuasion, and a willingness to work collaboratively with both political appointees and career staff.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between
Yes.
control and collaboration.
Exactly. And the source suggests that a savvy president needs to be able to strike that balance, to push their agenda forward, without alienating the very people they need to implement it.
Okay, so we've talked about policy development, the challenges of implementation, and the importance of having a well-functioning bureaucracy. But there's another crucial piece of the puzzle we haven't really discussed yet, the role of the public.
Ah, yes. Public opinion
Yeah.
can make or break a presidency. And it's something that this Project 2025 chapter is acutely aware of.
Right. You can have the best policies in the world,
Mhm.
but if you can't sell them to the American people, you're not going to get very far.
And that's where the Office of Communications comes in. Shaping the narrative, crafting the president's message,
Mm-hmm.
and engaging with the media, both traditional and social.
It's a constant battle for hearts and minds, trying to control the message in a world of 247 news and instant online commentary.
And the source emphasizes the importance of being proactive, of setting the agenda, rather than reacting to events.
So it's about getting out in front of the story, shaping the narrative before your opponents do.
Exactly. It's about anticipating criticisms, framing issues in a favorable light, and building a positive image for the president and their policies.
It sounds like a never-ending public relations campaign.
In a way it is, but it's not just about slick marketing. It's also about substance, about making sure that the president's actions match their words.
Because if there's a disconnect between rhetoric and reality, the public will quickly lose trust.
Exactly. So it's a delicate balancing act
Yeah.
between managing perceptions and actually delivering on your promises.
And the source suggests several strategies for effective public engagement.
Yes, they highlight the importance of regular communication, transparency, and a willingness to listen to feedback, even from those who disagree with the president.
So it's about building trust, showing that you're responsive to the concerns of ordinary Americans, and that you're working in their best interests.
Exactly. And that's where the Office of Public Liaison comes in, building relationships with interest groups, community organizations, and everyday citizens.
It's about reaching out beyond the Beltway bubble, connecting with people on the ground, and building a grassroots coalition of support for the president's agenda.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes the importance of targeting specific audiences, tailoring the message to resonate with their values and concerns.
So it's a multifaceted approach to public engagement, combining strategic communication, relationship building, and a genuine effort to understand and respond to the needs of the American people.
And it all feeds into that broader goal of creating a well-run government, one that is not just effective, but also responsive, transparent,
Wow.
and accountable to the citizens it serves.
Okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the intricacies of policy development to the challenges of implementation and the importance of public engagement. But there's another crucial aspect of governing we haven't really touched on yet, the role of Congress.
You're right. We can't talk about a well-run government
Yeah.
without acknowledging the crucial role of the legislative branch. After all, in our system, it's Congress that makes the laws, holds the purse strings,
Yeah.
and provides oversight of the executive branch.
So even with the best laid plans and the most competent staff, a president can't achieve their goals without working effectively with Congress.
Exactly. And the source highlights several key strategies for successful legislative engagement, including building relationships, understanding the legislative process, and being willing to compromise.
It's about knowing how to play the game on Capitol Hill, right? Knowing who to talk to, what levers to pull, and how to get your agenda passed into law.
Yes, and it requires a keen understanding of the political dynamics at play. Who are the key players? What are their priorities? What are the potential roadblocks?
And it's not just about pushing your own agenda, is it? It's also about understanding the needs and concerns of other members of Congress and finding ways to build coalitions and make deals.
Exactly. Successful legislative engagement requires a combination of strategic thinking, political savvy, and a willingness to work collaboratively across party lines.
And the source emphasizes the importance of having a dedicated team focused on this task, the Office of Legislative Affairs, which acts as the president's liaison to Congress.
They're the ones responsible for keeping track of legislation, building relationships with members and staff, and advocating for the president's priorities.
It's like a diplomatic mission within your own government, right? You're trying to build bridges, find common ground,
Right.
and get things done in a system that's often characterized by gridlock and partisan bickering.
And it's not always easy, especially in today's polarized political climate. But the source argues that effective legislative engagement is essential for any president who wants to enact their agenda and leave a lasting legacy.
So it's another crucial piece of that puzzle we're trying to put together, the puzzle of how to create a well-run government that can actually serve the needs of the American people.
And it highlights the interconnectedness of all these different aspects of governing. You can't have a successful presidency without effective staffing, a well-functioning bureaucracy, strong public support, and a productive relationship with Congress.
It's like a symphony orchestra, right? Each section has its own part to play, but they all need to work together harmoniously to create a beautiful piece of music.
And the conductor of that orchestra is the president, setting the tempo, guiding the performance, and ultimately responsible for the final product.
Okay, so we've talked about the role of Congress, the importance of public engagement, and the need for a well-functioning bureaucracy. But there's one more crucial element we need to consider. The president themselves, it feels like this chapter is saying, the president's personality and leadership style are almost as important as the structures they put in place.
Absolutely. The chapter focuses on mechanics, but it's clear that the president's ability to articulate a vision, make tough decisions, and inspire people is crucial.
Because you can have the best team in the world, but if the person at the top isn't up to the task, it's not going to work.
Right. This chapter almost paints the president as a kind of CEO managing a massive and complex organization. They need to understand the big picture, delegate effectively, and hold people accountable.
But it's more than just management, isn't it? It's about leadership, inspiring people, rallying them around a shared vision.
Exactly. And that's where things get a little less tangible. You can't just quantify charisma or decisiveness. Those are qualities that some presidents have and some don't.
And it seems like this chapter is arguing that a conservative president in 2025 needs a healthy dose of both. The strategic thinking of a CEO and the inspirational qualities of a leader.
Yes, because they're going to face enormous challenges, not just from political opponents, but also from within the bureaucracy itself. Remember, this chapter is written with the assumption that America is deeply divided, and that change won't come easily.
So it's almost like a call to arms for conservatives saying, look, if we're going to succeed, we need to be prepared to fight for it at every level.
And that fight starts with staffing. This chapter hammers home the point. That personnel is policy. You need people who are not only competent, but also completely on board with the president's agenda.
Because even a small handful of people in key positions can make a huge difference, either advancing the agenda or obstructing it.
Exactly. And the chapter provides a detailed roadmap for how to approach this challenge, outlining the key roles, the necessary skills, and the strategic mindset required for success.
It's like they've created a playbook for conservative governance.
In a way, yes. It's a guide to taking power and using it effectively to achieve specific goals.
And it doesn't shy away from the hardball tactics that might be necessary.
No, it's very upfront about the need to be strategic, even ruthless at times. This chapter is written for an audience that believes the stakes are very high and that they need to be willing to do whatever it takes to win.
Which is a bit unsettling, but also kind of refreshing in its honesty.
It is.
Yeah.
And it forces us to think critically about the nature of power and how it's wielded in a democratic system.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about conservatives versus liberals. It's about the fundamental tension between different visions
Yeah.
for how the country should be run.
Exactly. And regardless of which side you're on, I think we can all learn from the strategic thinking and the operational focus that this chapter brings to the table.
Because even if you disagree with the specific agenda, you can still appreciate the emphasis on effectiveness, on having a plan and executing it.
Right. And that's something we could probably all use a little more of in our own lives, whether we're running a business, leading a team, or just trying to achieve our personal goals.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Project 2025, I think the big takeaway is this idea that governing is a complex and challenging endeavor.
It's not for the faint of heart. It requires vision, strategic thinking, a willingness to make tough decisions, and, perhaps most importantly, the ability to build and manage a team of talented and dedicated individuals.
And it requires a deep understanding of the systems and structures that shape how power operates in our country.
Because as we've seen, the details matter. The seemingly mundane aspects of staffing and bureaucracy can have a profound impact on a president's ability to achieve their goals.
So whether you agree or disagree with the specific vision outlined in this chapter, I think we can all appreciate the importance of being engaged and informed about how our government works.
Because ultimately, the future of our country depends on citizens who are willing to learn, think critically, and participate in the process.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these ideas and perhaps explore some of the resources mentioned in the show notes.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
And remember, true love might be fleeting, but a well-run government is something worth fighting for. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone!